Great.
Oh, I'll just pause
Great.
the recording.
Hi everyone, my name is Aaron Baines. I'm the president of the Toronto chapter of the Canadian International Council. I'm joined by fellow board member Henry Loughton and Michael Chen, and of course our distinguished speaker, Dr. Yevgeniya Gaber. I'm just going to give a quick introduction of the CIC. You're all, of course, not here to hear about from me, but to hear about from Dr. Gaber and Henry on the war in the Ukraine and beyond the headlines. However, we just want to give a quick note to everybody about the CIC itself. Many of you will, of course, be familiar with our organization. We are a grassroots, civilian-led dialogue, space for dialogue on international affairs. The CIC was begun in one form or another almost 100 years ago, and under the principle of promoting a broader and deeper understanding of international affairs, Canada's role in the changing world by trying to provide interested Canadians with a nonpartisan nationwide forum for informed discussion, debate, and analysis. We at the Toronto branch strive to keep local members of the Toronto community informed about international affairs and how they affect Canada and how Canadians are making a difference in the world around them. And of course, this year and last year in particular, we have been forced to interact with the world around us in a variety of ways through, of course, the global COVID pandemic, and more recently, since then, the crisis in the departure of the American forces from Afghanistan, and now most heavily in our headlines and our hearts, of course, the crisis in Ukraine. So I'm going to turn it over now to Henry, but before I do so, I just want to quickly note, if you're not a member yet of the CIC, it's important that you become a member for a couple of reasons. One, you'll get more information on events like this and some of our member-only events, and also because organizations like the CIC, which are completely supported by their members, need membership and the modest membership fees, which are not particularly material, to be able to continue to survive and offer interesting, nonpartisan dialogue on the things happening around the world. So in the chat box there for everyone, I'm going to drop in the membership URL for the page. Take a look after the presentation, and please do sign up if you can. We would love to have you as a member. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Henry to go on and describe today's event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aaron. It is truly a distinct honor and pleasure to introduce to the CIC stage Dr. Yevgeniya Gaber. Dr. Gaber is a Ukrainian foreign policy expert whose work spans European and Black Sea regional security, as well as the foreign policies of Ukraine and Turkey. Since last September, she has been a non-resident fellow at the Center in Modern Turkish Studies, Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, Carleton University, Ottawa. As her non-resident status is now literal, she is joining us from Ankara, Turkey. Thank you very much. I know it's the middle of the night there. She recently served as foreign policy advisor to the Prime Minister of Ukraine from February and to December of last year, and deputy director of the Diplomatic Academy at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine from 2018 to 2021. Previously, she also served as political officer in the Embassy of Ukraine in Ankara and assistant professor international relations at Odessa National Mekhinov University. She holds an MA in International Relations from Odessa University and a PhD in Political Studies from Kyiv National Shevchenko University. She has also studied with the Aspen Institute of Kiev, University of Southern California Institute of Public Diplomacy, and George Marshall European Center for Security Studies. She is fluent in Ukrainian, Russian, English, Turkish, and speaks French. She is widely published. After her remarks, Dr. Gaber will take questions from the audience via the Q&A box in Zoom. Dr. Yevgeniya Gaber, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much, Henry, for this introduction, and thank you, Ron, and thank you everyone who joined us on this nice spring evening in Canada and nice spring night in Turkey. I will try to keep my remarks, introduction remarks, really short, because I would like it to be more a question and answers session, because if we speak about Ukraine and about the Russian aggression and Russian war in Ukraine, beyond headlines, I would really like to address those questions which are most interesting to you, and maybe those questions which you could not ask someone or get really information from the ground, because I'm Ukrainian myself, so I spent almost all of my life, except for the 4 years which I spent in Turkey, in Ukraine, in different parts of it. Just a couple of words about my own background. I come from Odessa, which is the southern region of Ukraine, which is a mostly Russian-speaking part of Ukraine, and which is supposed to be a part of the so-called Ruski Mir, if we use terminology of President Putin. So I'm definitely not the one who would be very, very pro-nationalistic and very, let's say, radical in views from the very beginning. It might have changed after this invasion, recent invasion, and this is the case for many Ukrainians and many of my friends who now switch from Russian language to Ukrainian, even in day-to-day life. In my case, I would always generally speak Ukrainian for my business trips and meetings, and then Russian in my family and with my friends, but this is not the case anymore. So this is probably one of the main conclusions and one of the main results of this war, this shift in mentality of many Ukrainians. Because for us, now it's perfectly clear that our life will never, ever be the same after this invasion. And this is probably the main result for President Putin, who actually achieved quite the opposite of what he was intending to achieve from the very beginning. And that is, in this regard, the first, I believe, victory of Ukraine and of Ukrainian national identity, of Ukrainian national idea, actually backfiring to Russia and to Putin's regime, because he got just the opposite of what he wanted. He tried to erase actually Ukrainian national identity, and now what we have in Ukraine, and I will speak about it a bit later in details, is a consolidation of national identity and the national building processes that we never ever had before. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, what we had in Ukraine was mostly state building processes, meaning that we de jure got our independence, our sovereignty on paper, and some kind of security assurances and guarantees under Budapest Memorandum and some other international treaties when we were accepting to actually refuse from our nuclear weapons and just say that for some time we'll be neutral state, not joining any blocs. Then it changed. We declared our desire to join NATO and the EU, and even put it in our constitution, so that now the European and Euro-Atlantic integration is, has been enshrined in our constitution. But now what we are witnessing in Ukraine is a completely different story. It's not about any kind of new state institutions or state building. It's about consolidation of national idea. It's about Ukrainians from all different parts of Ukraine, all different regions in the east, in the west, in the south of Ukraine, now getting this feeling and this awareness of being Ukrainian and being ready to fight for this choice. Being ready, if you want to die for this national idea. It might kind of be a bit pathetic when I say about this, but it's really how we feel now. If 10 years ago you would ask someone in Ukraine how you feel yourself, they would most probably say that, well, I'm a citizen of this or that city in Ukraine, and then someone would speak about different parts of cultural, national, religious identity. Now this Ukrainian identity, this national idea is something that is so crystal clear for every one of us. It has been consolidated, it has been crystallized because of this war and because of everything that President Putin has done to quote unquote save Ruski Mir in Ukraine. The other idea which backfired is, I believe, the situation within EU, within NATO, and in many other countries like Canada, for example, who used to have this feeling of security and actually living in the 21st century, democracy that do not go to war. So we do not have to worry about our defense. We do not want to worry about our armed forces. And let's say employment, unemployment, or some issues of economic development, climate changes, or some others would be number one on the agenda. And the security situation in the Black Sea region or in the Eastern Europe would be somewhere much lower on the national agenda. This is not the case anymore. I think that NATO countries and EU countries are themselves quite surprised with the level of unity and solidarity that they are now performing. And this is again something quite different from what Putin was expecting, because I believe with many different examples, with Afghanistan being the latest example, and President Trump's presidency, when we've witnessed huge problems in transatlantic ties between major NATO allies like the United States and Germany, for example, and with the politics of European agenda, actually with policies of many major European capitals, mainly caring about their national interests, including in the energy sector, including in economy, in many other realms. No one would really expect that those same nations can come together and be so solid in their support for Ukraine. So many different changes that are happening now, and I'm sure we will witness even more of that. They are not only tactical changes, right? They are not only about some changes in the way that decision-making processes are being taken. These are tectonical shifts. These are in many regards shifts of mentality, of sometimes cultural, sometimes ideological, sometimes religious, sometimes identity mentality, but very often also of security and defense mentality and strategic culture of many countries. Speaking generally, in many cases, not even in Europe, not even in NATO countries, but in some regions like, let's say, Indo-Pacific, now we see dramatic changes in policies of many countries like Japan, for example, like Australia, like Switzerland, like Finland. So many of those countries who have traditionally been quite passive in the defense area, in the military area, they are now taking more and more active stance, showing their support to Ukraine and contributing to our defense capacities and capabilities by very practical and tangible things. This is something that you would probably not see any time before that. So this is kind of a general framework. I will tell a couple of things that I believe are really important to understand the situation in Ukraine now. And then in the questions and answers part, I think that we can discuss any of these kind of more geopolitical, broader framework things, especially talking about those issues, those factors, and those parameters that would be interesting to you. I will share now, I will try at least to share my screen with you. Just a moment, let me do it this way. To show you the map of Ukraine, and of what is now going on in Ukraine, for you just to understand what is going on there. I believe that before that, and that was one of the main probably victories for Ukraine so far. Before this war, I think that very few of you would really know where Ukraine is, what is the geography of Ukraine, and sometimes, at least since I'm based here in Turkey, sometimes I would get even questions about, well, where Ukraine is and what are the main cities of Ukraine and so on. But now many people know the names and the location of such small villages and cities as Bucha, as Irpin, as some others in the Kiev region, unfortunately, because of the atrocities, because of the war crimes that Russia has been committing there. But still, I think this is, again, one of the things that has dramatically changed in terms of public diplomacy, in terms of international reputation of Ukraine, in terms of even geographical knowledge. So this map that I put on the cover here, on the front page here, is actually showing Ukrainian map overlapped with the map of Europe. And I think that before this invasion, very few of people would really know that Ukraine is the largest country in Europe. So whatever is happening now in Ukraine, with the use of chemical weapons, like we had today in the morning in Mariupol, with the looting and raping and war crimes and atrocities against civilians, this is happening in the 21st century, in the heart of Europe, in the largest European country. And that is why this is something that we have to care about, because what happens in Ukraine definitely will not stay in Ukraine. This will be a precedent for many other countries, for many other authoritarian regimes to act the same way or not to act the same way if they're not allowed to act this way in the future. And this is something that very often is disregarded, because from the very beginning we struggled a lot to explain that, okay, what happens in Ukraine is not only about European security, it is about transatlantic security, it is about global security, and it is about, for example, how China will act in the future, because it's now obvious that whatever Russia is doing in Ukraine and whatever response it can get as a result of its illegal and illegitimate actions in Ukraine will have huge implications for next steps which might be taken by any other country in the world, right? So very often Ukraine is compared to Taiwan and Russia is compared to China. But it's not only about actually occupying the neighboring country. It's also about the right to use nuclear weapons, to use nuclear blackmailing, to use any kind of ammunition which are banned under all international treaties, under Rome Statute, under the Geneva Convention. And if nothing happens after this, if nothing happens after what Russia is doing in Ukraine, this means that in fact, we're giving a carte blanche to any other illiberal actor and any other authoritarian regime in the world, which might want to take the same path and to act in the future the same way. The same goes for maritime security, for aggression on sea, and I will talk very shortly about that in a couple of minutes. So this is why now actually the whole world system is going through a test in Ukraine. International organizations like the United Nations, for example, whether something is happening there or not, whether we have a reform of United Nations and of its Security Council mechanisms or not, if the aggressor state can still be a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, can use its veto right to block any kind of decisions, right? They are like China, like Russia. If nothing happens, then the question is what in the future happens to the United Nations as the organization which is now blocked and paralyzed by this veto right of the aggressor state. The same goes for many other organizations in different areas and different spheres, starting from nuclear safety and security and up to humanitarian organizations like Red Cross and others. So that is why the war in Ukraine, beyond the headlines, is actually the war in Ukraine as it is reflected or might be reflected in each and every particular country, in each and every particular society, in each and every particular case, legal case, international law, international organizations, and so on. How it all started, I think that most of you would think about the first stage of this war in 2022, when we speak about how it all started, talking about the three main dimensions of Russian aggression from Belarus, from the eastern part, where we have already had these occupied parts of Lugansk and Donetsk regions bordering with Russia, and then from the occupied Crimea. However, this is not how it all started. And to understand the failures of Russia and the successes of Ukraine now, which I believe many experts still have difficulties in explaining, how Ukraine, being quite a small country with small armed forces compared to the Russian armed forces, is still there fighting with the Russians and doing it quite successful. And we're now in the 47th day of this war. So to understand this, I think that we have to go much deeper in the history of open confrontation with the Russian Federation, and to speak about the hybrid warfare, which we've been in for 80 years now, and which had actually a positive impact on Ukraine, on Ukrainian armed forces, on Ukrainian society in terms of contributing to our resilience, to reforms in the Ukrainian armed forces, in our information security, in our ability to resist as a whole, as a single nation, a single Ukrainian society, starting from armed forces, National Guard, but also going to women, men, children, elderly people who are now fighting with the Russians on different fronts. So I would say that something you would probably not very often meet somewhere in the headlines or in the media would be those small cases when you have each and every Ukrainian citizen fighting their own wars in their places, in those spheres, in those areas where they can be most effective. So now I believe this can be used as a characteristics of Ukrainian war for its independence, when you have experts and journalists fighting their information warfare against Russian propaganda, fake news, and all kind of information campaigns that Russians are now having inside the country, in Ukraine, in Russia, abroad, in the Western media, working with the think tanks, with different analytical centers and so on. We have this experience of more than 8 years of hybrid warfare, so we know how to effectively counter these destructive narratives. And this is why I believe that now we're doing much better our job than we did in 2014, for example. The same goes for Russians' multiple efforts to destabilize situation from within. And we've also been prepared for that, because we had that before. We had those efforts to economically, socially, politically destabilize situation from within many times, starting from the occupation of Crimea and Donbas region in 2014. So this is why the initial plan of Russians to overthrow the government, to change Zelensky's government, and then to occupy Ukraine in a couple of days failed. So no blitzkrieg, so-called, in 2 or 3 days was possible. No efforts to use protests and some kind of rallies and destabilization from inside the country were successful. That is how Russia had to invade in Ukraine, and that is how it still, even a couple of weeks after the start of invasion, with all its attempts to work with different political parties, with different political forces in Ukraine, failed. If in 2014 we still had quite a lot of pro-Russian parties and pro-Russian forces in Ukraine, now in 2022, firstly, there is no political party in Ukraine that would openly support Russia. Just because when you talk about being pro-Russian in foreign policy and having more of a pro-Russian agenda in foreign policy is quite different from having Russian troops on the ground and from having your sovereignty, your territorial integrity under question. So even the most kind of pro-Russian political forces from the very beginning stated that they would support, and they did support the government of Zelensky. And I think this is this has been also one of the main mistakes, major mistakes of Putin's regime and of Putin's intelligence services, not to take into account the level of political support that Zelensky and his government would get from his political opponents even. Those parties who were openly pro-Russian in many cases just said they ceased to exist, so they are not existing anymore in many city councils, even in the eastern, even in the southern regions of Ukraine. Just today, this is a very new development. Medvedchuk, who is a godfather of Putin and who used to be the leader of one of pro-Russian forces in Ukraine, and he fled the country during the first hours of invasion. He was a couple of hours ago. He was brought to Kiev by the SBU, Ukrainian intelligence forces, and that's also an interesting development to see what information we get there. But that was probably one of the few members of parliament who actually left Ukraine during the first hours of invasion, and all the others, they stayed there and they actually supported Ukraine. And the same did almost all population in the most kind of allegedly pro-Russian regions. And this is again important to understand. I don't think how much of that information and that understanding you have, but I would say that for many Russian speakers in Ukraine, being Russian speakers and at the same time Ukrainian patriots, Ukrainian nationalists, is something that we are really proud of, just because this is a part of a liberal, democratic, multicultural, multinational Ukraine, and this is how we feel comfortable. So the very right to defend, the possibility to defend our rights to speak whatever language we want, to practice whatever religious services we want, is how we were feeling being Ukrainians. So this diversity, this is something that has always been very important for us. And this desire, this will for a free life in Ukraine, this is something that we can defend and that we will definitely defend in any cases, even if we are facing the aggression from the army, which is like the second largest army in the world. That is why, and now, moving faster to the current situation in Ukraine, on the first stage, any attempts to occupy Kiev, to capture those huge territories in the northern part of Ukraine, like Sumy and Chernihiv and all of that, they actually failed. So on the second stage, which has started like a couple of days ago, with the also change of the chief of Ukrainian military campaign in Russia, bringing General Dvornikov there, and with the change of general strategy in Russia, the main attention will be focused on the eastern regions of Ukraine, the let's say Donetsk, Lugansk, Kharkiv regions, and the southern regions of Ukraine, both because of their strategic importance, meaning that if Russia occupies these territories like Kherson, Mykolaiv, Odessa regions, it will be able to cut Ukraine off the Black Sea. And for us, Black Sea is critically important because 75–80% of our import and export operations are also made via our Black Sea ports. But also ideologically, because these regions in Russian mentality are also perceived as the so-called Ruski Mir, Russian world regions. And those regions always have traditionally been the most vulnerable towards Russian propaganda, disinformation campaigns, and so on, all kind of subversive operations, which is no more the case. But still, both in order to get this corridor from the Donbas region and then via Berdyansk, Mariupol, to Crimea, to Odessa, and then to the Transnistria region, which has also been under Russian occupation since 1992. And because this is strategically important parts in order to get dominance and to get advantage in the Black Sea region, these parts, which you now see in pink color on the map, these are those regions which are heavily under Russian attack at the moment. The losses of Russian army are huge. No one would believe that Ukrainian army would be able to cause those huge losses to Russia. We can talk about different tactics and strategy which has been used to that. Of course, the military assistance from the Western partners and from all of our partners have played a crucial role here. But yet again, it's also about the strategy which has been chosen by Ukrainian armed forces. It's because of the huge and very, very high level of trust of Ukrainian people and Ukrainian soldiers to the chief of general staff and to the Minister of Defense, who had been appointed just a couple of months before the invasion started. So many different factors, and of course the general, as I say, the general resilience and resistance of Ukrainian society there. But still, on the second stage of the invasion, it's getting more and more difficult for us to defend our regions, also because of the change of strategy in Russian army. They're also learning their lessons. They're also changing their tactics. They are also getting more and more weapons, including from other pariah states, not to name them here. And also because of the maritime dimension of this war in Ukraine, which is a much more difficult one for Ukraine rather than the land part of the warfare. We do need more weapons to defend ourselves from air. That's why Ukraine has also been so vocal about this need of getting some kind of no-fly zone over Ukraine, and then getting at least the new sophisticated air defense systems and all kind of fighter jets and everything that would help us actually protect ourselves from the air, but also from the sea. Because previously, even before this invasion started, we had large parts of the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov blocked by Russian warships and Russian Navy. But now the situation that we have is a complete blockade of Ukraine from the sea. And then those warships that are there, they are hitting Odessa region, Mykolaiv region, actually all of Ukraine with the caliber missiles and all other missiles which are there on these warships. So even though the Turkish straits were closed by Turkey for new warships coming from the Mediterranean, but those which are still there now, they have they bear one of the biggest threats for Ukrainian civilians, Ukrainian civil society, civilians, not only the armed forces, but also our residential areas because of the small distance and because of the high speed of these missiles, which are launched from the warships in the Black Sea. So in case they are launched from Crimea or from some warships in the Black Sea, we almost do not have time even for any kind of alarm system to work and for letting people know to proceed to their shelters. So very often you would first hear some shots and bombings and explosions, and afterwards the system would start working because there is very little time period in between the launch of these missiles from the Black Sea and then the actual moment when they hit the target. Why it is also important because of the economic security, because of the food security. So actually we do not have this opportunity to get connected, to be connected to the world via our seaports. And a last point, which I will make here, and then I will stop for the questions and the answers, but this is also something that we can discuss later and that I believe would be really interesting to discuss, is the whole cultural, historical, and then identity issues that also have to be taken into consideration when we speak about Russian and Ukrainian relations, because it's not only about the desire to restore the Soviet Union, it's not only the desire to change the world order and to confront NATO and some other nations in Ukraine. It's also about the obsession of not having Ukraine as a state and not having Ukrainians as a nation. If you check these three pieces, which you can see on your screens now, about the so-called historical unity of Russians, Ukrainians, and then the recent one in RIA Novosti about what Russia should do with Ukraine, it's absolutely obvious that the final objective would be not even the change of the government in Kiev, but actually not having Ukraine as a nation, not having Ukrainians as people, and not having Ukrainians actually living in their territories. And if we go back to our history, you will very easily see that this is something that we have always had in our relations with the Russians struggling for our independence. We had Holodomor famine in 1932, 1933 under Stalin regime. What Russians are doing now, they're specifically targeting and hitting our grain storages, our civilian infrastructure, and not to let Ukraine go into the new sowing season and not to be able to maintain our status of a breadbasket of Europe. We had deportation of Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians back in the 20th century. Now we have deportations of civilians in Mariupol, in the eastern regions of Ukraine, when Russians bring them to Russia forcefully, take away their passports, and then send to Siberia, to other regions. So nothing changed there. The same methods used against civilians with all kinds of tortures, raping, looting, and so on. So this is actually not only a war of Russia against Ukraine, but this is, I would say, also a centuries-long struggle of Ukrainians to be a separate nation with self-identification as Ukrainian nation and to be an independent state. I will stop here, and then I will be happy to answer your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gaber. To summarize a war from a strategic, political, and historical perspective in a half an hour is an incredible achievement. Thank you so much for illuminating us. I must say, before I ask an introductory question or two, and then reading the questions we've received in Q&A, that in debates of foreign policy issues in Canada and in Europe that I've participated in, including at NATO, going back to the 70s, I have not seen, few have contained the moral imperative, sustained public interest, and demonstrated unity of purpose as the war in Ukraine. And in my view, European security and the future democratic nations as free nations require a democratic victory. And there is a phenomenal consensus on that part. But as we are a civil society, there are some dissenting voices or some questions as our understanding. And it will be my pleasure to raise some of those questions from our audience. But to put a chapeau on it, or opening point, we would welcome your view as to what is the biggest surprise for you since the outbreak of the war, given to some extent Ukraine, oh dear, not good timing. Ukraine has anticipated this coming for some time. And what do you believe a Canadian audience does not understand or appreciate about the conflict, especially about the information war about the conflict? So I will mute in case my phone rings again and let you respond to those two. And I promise the audience that we've got queued up to pose those to Dr. Gaber. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry. Well, for me, and I believe for many Ukrainians, the biggest surprise was in this war was not about Putin, not about armed forces of Russia, but about the reaction of common Russians, about the reaction of Russian society to what is going on in Ukraine. This is incredible. The level of support of Russian people to invasion in Ukraine and to Russian aggression in Ukraine now is 83%. Before or during the first days of this invasion, or it's called a special military operation in Russia, so support for this so-called military operation was something like 71% when it started. It's 83 now. Here, I believe, of course, there is a big part of disinformation, a big part of brainwashing, a big part of many, many years of the work of Russia Today, Sputnik, and all kinds of channels. I believe that people still could check information because until recently, there were all kinds of YouTube, Telegram channels in Russia. I mean, we're living in the 21st century, right? With all kinds of technology, with all kinds of different sources of information. Russians were comfortable with not knowing the truth. And that was something that was absolutely okay for them because the truth they had was probably the one they wanted to see and feel. Of course, I would get an argument that most people would be afraid to say that they do not support war in Ukraine when they are asked even for a social poll just because of the authoritarian regime in Russia. Also, that can be true to some couple of percent. But when you listen to the answers and response of a Russian respondent there, how in details they explain what they would do to Ukrainians, how they would kill them, how they would torture them, what they would do to Ukrainian women, to Ukrainian children. You cannot believe this is true. You cannot believe this is happening in the 21st century. When we have intercepted phone conversations of Russian soldiers who are captured in, some of them, they are captured in Ukraine, and then they are allowed to have a phone conversation with their relatives. Sometimes these are phone conversations intercepted by our intelligence services. What their women, what their partners or wives would say them is not how you feel yourself, what happens to you if you're wounded or not. It's what brand of lady bag or of whatever outfit she would like her husband to bring from Ukraine. When he's saying that, well, we're looting here, so we're just entering these houses of rich Ukrainians everywhere, and they even have, you know, like normal roads, and they have electricity in the suburbs of Kiev. So those women would say something like, okay, you know, the size of clothes or of shoes of our children. So in case you kill Ukrainian children, please bring me number 23 or whatever to my child, because I desperately need this or that kind of stuff. And this is awful. Today, last example, we also had this intercepted conversation when a Russian woman is saying to her husband in Ukraine, you can rape Ukrainian women, do that. I allow you to rape Ukrainian women, but please, I'm sorry, use condoms so that you protect yourself, and don't tell me in details. But I know that, I mean, I'm allowing you to do that. This is something incredible. And I think this is the main surprise for me when I talk even to my relatives in Russia, when they tell me that you deserve what you have, and that Ukrainians do not deserve a right to live and to be there. So every time I hear an argument about bad Putin and good Russians, and the problem is not with the Russian society, it's with the regime, I would argue that we have huge problems with Russian society, unfortunately, and that's why the problem is much broader. The second question, which you asked about the Canadian society and what parts are underappreciated, underevaluated, I still think that the world has waked up to a new reality after the 24th of February, but the awareness of this new reality is coming very slowly. It's coming, but we don't have time, because every day our people are dying. There is still a lot to be discovered, unfortunately. Very sad news, very tough news about what has happened in those territories which have been occupied by Russians, by Kadyrov forces, but also by Russian troops. The atrocity, the war crime that they are committing here are just incredible. We have to react to that, because we don't even speak about war anymore. We speak about genocide of Russian forces against Ukrainians. We speak about them specifically killing Russian children, Ukrainian children, Ukrainian women. They have lists of activists, of journalists, of anyone, including like myself, those people who would speak against Russians if they are in Ukraine, if they are under the occupation. They literally, like in the Nazi times, in the fascist times, they have torture rooms. They have places where they kill people just for their political position or for their social, I don't know, affiliation or something like this. So I think this is still under-evaluated very much, because for many people, it's an armed conflict between Russia and Ukraine, but it's not. It's killing of civilian Ukrainians, torturing them, and violating any possible and impossible norms of international humanitarian law. And I believe that we have to pay much more attention to this dimension of this war as well. Can't hear you.
The famous words of COVID, you're on mute. Must get to the questions from our audience. We have one question that asserts that the media wants us to believe that Putin is solely responsible for the tensions in Ukraine, but the narrative is conveniently leaving out the decades of Western aggression against Russia that got us here. What are your thoughts on that comment?
Well, my thought is that this is something that Russia would like to see, and this is a Russian narrative, which I stay in Turkey. So I feel it's very often here when people would say it's not Russia to be blamed, it's the West to be blamed, because this is aggressive West, and this is because of Ukraine's desire to join NATO and NATO's enlargement to the East. I can answer this question with another question. In 2014, was Ukraine joining NATO? when Crimea was occupied, when we had the first wave of Russian military aggression in Ukraine, in the Donbas region, there were no talks about Ukraine joining NATO. There are no NATO bases in Ukraine. There are no NATO military, NATO troops in Ukraine. The only troops and tanks and bases that we have in Ukraine are Russian ones. If you look at the map of the border of Russia neighboring with NATO countries, it would be something like 1% or something like this. So of course, no one ever can talk about any kind of aggression against Russia or even any kind of threats against Russia. But what we see now is Russia moving troops to its border with Finland, for example, after the first statement that Finland might consider an option of joining NATO. So this is a very Russian style tactics of actually calling black white and white the black. So turning up and down everything that is not in Russia's best interest, but the facts are proven quite the opposite. If you look at the history of all aggression, acts of aggression, which we have had after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, those would be the acts of aggression by the Russian Federation. In Georgia in 2008, large parts, 20% of territories were occupied by Russian. In Moldova, in Transnistria happened the same. We have Russian forces in Nagorno-Karabakh, we have Russians in Syria, we have Russians all over the region, we have Russians in Ukraine, but we don't have any kind of that act of aggression by NATO. So of course, it's obvious, especially now after the recent invasion in Ukraine, that the only aggressor state is Russia, and no way we can talk about any kind of aggression or aggressive moves from the Western blocs.
Thank you. The same speaker asks if the path to peace is A, ending NATO's expansion along Russia's borders. And in fact, there is no, in brackets, I'll say there is no NATO expansion along Russia's borders currently, or B, inviting Russia to join NATO. Do you think an invitation for Russia to join NATO is possible? And is that a path to peace?
Well, I don't think invitation to NATO is possible anyways. I don't even think that normal dialogue between Russia and NATO is possible at the moment or in the nearest future. We had this desire to reset relations with Russia, which I mean, characterized Trump's administration, Obama's administration, many other administrations, and then the policies of many European leaders. And the only thing that we've seen so far is that the only language Russia understands is the language of force. So we need more NATO, we need more weapons, we need more assertive power, not to escalate, but to de-escalate. Because Russia will always push to the limits, and any kind of dialogue initiative, desire to appease Russia will only lead to further aggression, to further war crimes from the Russian side. When you have a victory on the battleground, then you can get to the table of negotiations with Russians. That is the only thing which at the moment is possible. If we want to have any meaningful negotiations, not to win some time, not to use it as part of general tactics, but meaningful negotiations with Russia, then you have to defeat Russia on the battleground. And after that, you want to get back to the table of negotiations. Otherwise, any kind of political bargaining, any kind of negotiations, inviting Russia to NATO, creating any kind of new security structures with the involvement of Russia at this current moment will not help. It will only lead to more atrocities and to more aggression from Russian side. I mean, when you listen to Lukashenko and Putin's today's press conference, you can imagine what would be their answer to any invitation to join NATO. But important to understand here, Ukraine is now flexible. So even President Zelensky said, and was heavily criticized by expert community and society in Ukraine, that Ukraine will probably not join NATO in the nearest like 5-10 years, just because NATO nations will not also accept Ukraine as a member of the North Atlantic Organization. So we can talk about a new security structure when we talk to different countries, including 5 permanent members of the Security Council of the UN, plus Turkey, plus Israel, plus Germany, and some other countries, so that they would create this a new system of security guarantees for Ukraine. It is yet to be seen to which extent this is possible, what kind of implementation mechanisms we will have there, which of the countries would agree to that. So we can discuss new security architecture in Europe or in the global terms, but this is no way this will be in place of NATO. This can be a temporarily implemented decision to de-escalate and to have ceasefire and then to proceed with the further negotiations. But in the long-term perspective, this is still a sovereign right of Ukraine to choose whether or not to join NATO. And I believe that now we have something like 70% of public support to that option.
Thank you. I think you have answered, in part at least, the next question. And to save time, I will give you 2. And I'll give an advance note that I will test the other the participants and the organizers to see if we can get about 10 more minutes if Dr. Gaber agrees to get into questions. The next 2 questions were the next question that was asked was, what do you believe is an acceptable result and short of outright victory? And what is your evaluation of the ICC chief prosecutor's activities? Are they moving with sufficient sense of purpose? And how is he cooperating with experts and leaders in Ukraine?
Great questions. Starting from the first one, there is no way that we can compromise on the territorial integrity of Ukraine. The only Ukraine we have is the Ukraine within the borders of 1991, meaning including Donbass, including Crimea. This is very principled. This is the red line for government, for society, for everyone. At the same time, we understand, being realistic, that it would be really difficult to get back Crimea now, for example, even if we have a victory on the ground, and even if our armed forces prove to be successful on the second stage of this warfare. So for this, for the ceasefire, I would say the minimum that we want to get from Russia is getting back to the status quo, like it was before February 24, before this invasion, with the further restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty over Donbass and Crimea as well. Other things like Ukrainian membership in NATO, any kind of new security structure and so on can be negotiated. But it's very important not to make territorial integrity a part of political negotiation, because this is about international law. You cannot negotiate something like war crimes. You cannot negotiate something like territories of a sovereign state. You can negotiate political constellations. You can negotiate alliances, but you cannot negotiate something that is crystal clear under international law, just because you will create a precedent when everything can be questioned. Everything. All borders can be redrawn, all maps can be remade, and then there is nothing solid that you have in the end. And also because after all the casualties among civilians, among our soldiers and armed forces that we had, there is no way we're gonna compromise on this and that part of the territory. So the minimum result, which would be acceptable for us, first of all, ceasefire, withdrawal of Russian troops to the position before February 24, and of course, we keep separately the war crimes which have to be, which actually have to be investigated under the international law, international organizations, and with the participation of a wide audience, not only in Ukraine, but also in the West, which is a bridge to the second question, because we are now at the same time in the process of gathering testimonies and evidences of all those war crimes. We're cooperating with our international partners, with the International Court of Justice, Criminal Court, and so on. So I'm not a specialist on that particular question, but I know that this is a very active and dynamic cooperation. We've had many proposals from different prosecutors and lawyers and you know, those people who have been involved in many other cases, in Rwanda, for example, in Balkan cases, in other war crimes. So we do cooperate on the level of civil society organizations, and also with the government, with the other Western governments. Many countries, many partners have also said that they will practically help us with gathering all those evidences, filing them, structuring them, because these are huge. These are like thousands and thousands of different cases in different areas, from raping and looting to using banned ammunition. But this work is also in active process, and I would say that this is so far, this has been quite good and dynamic cooperation.
Thank you. We're running out of time, but I will leave you with two final questions. One is your comment about Russia's potential use of chemical weapons and how you'd expect the West to respond. And the final question, can find it here, is could you comment on the significance of the arrest of Viktor Medvedchuk? Why is it important to the Ukrainian government now? And what are the implications going forward? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So with the chemical weapons, we have had initial claims from our soldiers on the ground in Mariupol that most probably these have been chemical weapons used today in the morning. We cannot provide any kind of evidence at the moment, just because this is a territory which is under strike all the time, under attacks, under missile strikes, under artillery fire. So there is no way you can send an expert to get any evidence there. But with the information that we have at the moment, this has most probably been some kind of a chemical agent which was used there. What we would expect is, of course, this to be a game changer, because I can remind the words of President Biden, for example, when he was asked what would be a red line for the United States to change its stance on Ukraine, on situation of non-involvement more deeply in Ukraine. And war with Russia, he said that the use of chemical weapons, this has not been something used widely so far in a small area, but still this is something that has been used. And as the General Dvornikov, who is now head of the Ukrainian campaign and used to lead the Syrian campaign, as he said yesterday, we cannot fight Ukrainians in Mariupol, so we have to use chemical weapons. And this is something that is widely broadcasted everywhere. So you can just go and check there. In case this is the case, and we have new cases of use of chemical weapons against Ukrainians, then I would expect not only increase in weapons to Ukraine, but also involvement of other countries in this war. I don't think that we will have this. I don't think this is realistically, because still there is the fear of the Third World War, of the nuclear war, and so on. But I would expect at least a change of understanding that the decision-making processes as they are now, they are not effective. There is bureaucracy, there is, of course, something that has to be done as a part of international organizations functioning, but then there are thousands of lives of real people, Ukrainians, who can die every moment and who are dying every day. So I would, of course, expect more than just another round of deep concerns from our partners. And here, very briefly, I just have to add that that's also not on the headlines very often, but what Russia has been doing so far, already using nuclear weapons, already using chemical weapons in a different way. Because we had factories with ammonium, for example, attacked by Russians, with all kinds of chemical substances in different parts of Ukraine, which were hit by missiles. And when people could not breathe and could not like open windows and doors and just go outside for days, especially in the eastern regions of Ukraine, because Russians specifically attack this infrastructure and these facilities which produce all kind of poisonous chemical materials. The same goes for NPPs, nuclear power plants. They're being occupied and attacked by Russians, like Zaporizhia, for example, like Chernobyl. And this is also a kind of a nuclear war, because if you have 15 reactors in Ukraine in 4 nuclear power plants, which are under Russian fire, and if they explode, we will literally have 15 Chernobyls at the same time in Ukraine. So we do have to be very clear about what is happening here. And it's much more than a conventional weapons which are used in this war in Ukraine. And I believe this is gonna get worse and worse, just because Russians want to get any kind of victory by May 9, which is a symbolic date for them. So unfortunately, I expect even more cynical acts like this use of alleged use of chemical weapons today in Mariupol. And the second question, if you can remind me, what was the second one?
The recap, I closed the list of questions. The capture of
Medvedchuk, yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Well, Medvedchuk was Putin's person in Ukraine, to put it shortly and bluntly. He is not only his friend and the godfather and everything, he is the main pro-Russian personality in Ukraine since the Yanukovych times. He is important for us because he most probably knew about this invasion from the very beginning. So he possesses really important and precious information for our intelligence services, but also because he can be a trump card in our hands in negotiating with Russia. Half jokingly, half seriously, Zelensky already tweeted after his arrest today in the evening that since Medvedchuk is a Russian son, then would you like to exchange your son to Ukrainian sons and daughters who are now captured and held in Russia and in Russia-controlled territories. So that might also be an option for a swap of prisoners, or at least for opening humanitarian corridors from Mariupol and other territories besieged by Russia, and those cities where we actually have a humanitarian catastrophe now. So I do believe there would be some other conditions for this exchange of prisoners, but still this is a politically important figure, a figure which is very close to Putin, and a person who has been wanted in Ukraine for many, many weeks so far.
Thank you so much. I've learned so much in this last hour and a few minutes. Thank you again for joining us from Istanbul in the middle of the night or early hours of your morning. I would now normally, if we had this as a live meeting, present you with a bottle of wine. But since I will have the opportunity to present you that virtually, and see if we can arrange something for upon your return to Ottawa. We'd like to remind everyone that you have been watching a presentation of the Canadian International Council, Toronto branch. And if you want to get more information about CIC or join, and there are many memberships, opportunities and advantages of membership. The website is thecic.org/become a member. Okay, thank you so much. We've run a bit over time. I appreciate everyone who's held in, and take care, everyone. Stay safe, and we'll see you on the next event. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you again, Dr. Gaber.
Thank you.
This has been great.
Thank you.
We can
Thank you very much.
when you're back in Ottawa. Take care.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.